CNN, were they right to fire their employees?
Absolutely not. I think this is extremely unethical, and it's part of a worrying trend that we're seeing, not just in the US, but particularly in the US over recent weeks. United Airlines, Delta Airlines have also brought in mandatory vaccine policies. We don't know exactly where this office was, the CNN office, because in the United States, it's obviously a federal system. So there are 50 states and 50 different ways of approaching the issue of mandatory vaccination. But it's very clear from Biden that the United States government does want some kind of push in this way. They're discussing potentially using federal law to withhold funds from certain institutions to try and pressure people into taking the vaccine. And other big companies like Uber, Google, Facebook have also brought in mandatory vaccinations for their staff. The United States government also mandating vaccinations for government staff in particular states, especially like New York City and California. And I think this is really worrying because it is on a number of levels, a number of ethical levels. Firstly, on the topic of medical consent, if you're essentially de facto forcing people into taking the vaccine, then that undermines the concept of medical consent, which sets a really, really worrying precedent. And it's also a problem of medical confidentiality. Can you imagine a situation where, for example, people were asked to share whether or not they were HIV positive in order to work for a particular company, or if women were asked to disclose whether or not they were pregnant? So we should be really worried about the precedent this sets.
Okay, I understand about the precedent, but isn't that slightly conflating the issue here? That we have an international global pandemic. Governments obviously are trying to do what they can to do this. Are you of the view that we should be using a stick, if you like, to persuade people to take the vaccine, or should we be using a carrot to say we'd like you to be vaccinated? Or do you think that we should not be doing any of this at government level and just letting people make their own minds up?
I think that we should be carrot and stick hesitant on both fronts. I think the carrot is less problematic than the stick. I certainly don't think we should be using the stick in any way whatsoever. And I think that's really worrying. And actually,
so what do you then make of the fact? What do you make of the fact then that the government have been saying you will have to be vaccinated, double vaccinated, if you want to go to certain venues after the autumn? That the indication appears to be that double vaccination is going to be your route, particularly back into the hospitality industry, and the government seem to be sucked into that.
Yeah, I'm wholly against it. And I think that there is an ethical screw loose, actually, that the government would even consider this in the first place. Because I do take the point when people say that this is a global pandemic, this is an emergency situation. But in fact, that is very short sighted on a number of fronts, because we should be concerned about the precedent this sets and where this could take us further down the line, not only in terms of medical consent, but also in terms of forms of digital ID cards, as people say, the sort of show us your papers society. But also because, as we've seen yesterday, also reported that there is mounting evidence that the vaccine doesn't prevent transmission, particularly of the Delta variant, but doesn't necessarily, as the World Health Organization have pointed out, there isn't very much evidence, enough evidence to suggest the efficacy of reducing transmission to make vaccine passports even make rational sense. So that is slightly beside the point.
What about for international travel? Is it acceptable for governments to enforce, or certainly for us as travellers to be enforced, to demonstrate that either we have a double vaccine or indeed a negative test in order to travel?
I think that there's a slight difference in ethical terms between the idea of domestic vaccine passports and vaccine passports for international travel, just simply because what other countries choose to do is really none of our business, in the same way that it's really none of our business what somebody else chooses to do with regards to their own decision to take any particular medical intervention, like having a vaccine. And so I think it's a slightly different issue because, as has been pointed out before, there are certain countries that do require you to have certain vaccinations to travel there under normal circumstances. That is a very, very different thing to having to share your medical information, your vaccine status with private companies in exchange for services.
Do you think that if anybody were to be fired for not having the double vaccination, do you think that particularly here in the UK, should they be taking legal action? Is it a breach of employment contract? Is it a breach of the Equality Act? Is it a breach of human rights here in the United Kingdom?
Well, certainly in the United States, in the context of this particular story, there have been lawyers on US media saying that there are, there's potential for lawsuits, not that they would necessarily be successful. In the UK, I think that it should be the case that under the Equality Act, it was already been found by a parliamentary committee that vaccine passports would be discriminatory, and the government chose to go ahead with these measures anyway. I don't know how successful. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how successful those lawsuits would be. But I certainly think that it should be the case that people should be able to take legal action if they're discriminated against on the grounds of their medical status. And I really don't think that we should be living in a society where people should have to share any medical status, vaccine status, or otherwise with any employer or a private company in exchange for services.
There's a lot of discussion in today's papers about lower take up by younger people here in the UK of the vaccines. I think there is a significant take up at older levels of our population. What would you say to those younger people? Should the government be encouraging them to take the vaccine? Should it simply be down to their choice? Should we not be interfering at all? Should we be worried that younger people are not taking it?
I think the whole idea of creating incentives through things like free taxi rides and free slices of pizza through Deliveroo, which is something that's been discussed in recent weeks, I think that also has ethical problems because it's appealing to people's it's appealing to something that is more than just people's reason, trying to influence them to make a particular medical decision rather than allowing them to just assess the facts themselves, make their own risk assessment, and then make a decision on the basis of that. So I think that there are problems in terms of trying to incentivize people in that way, younger people particularly, who are of a different risk profile to older generations. But also I think that there are other ways of making the vaccine more accessible to those who might decide to take it on the basis of their own reasoning. So, for example, having pop-up vaccination centres in particular areas to make it more accessible for those who do want to take it. But it should be a case of making it more accessible rather than a case of trying to incentivize people who otherwise wouldn't want to take it for whatever reason, trying to get them to bypass their own personal reasoning on it in order to get some kind of free trinket.
And just finally to you, how do we combat this in our sort of work society on the basis that governments don't seem to be very keen to take on any company who says that it must be mandatory to have a double vaccination?
I think depending on people's views, you need to stand your ground. So my personal view is that I just simply will not share my vaccination status at all, because I think that it's wrong that people should be asked to. And I think whether you're vaccinated,
well, even if you're going abroad, or would you choose not to go abroad?
I think I would choose not to go abroad because I think that whether you're
Really?
vaccinated. I think whether you're unless I absolutely had to, but I think if whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, people should, as you have just said yourself, take a stand in favour of people's right to make that decision themselves.
But hang on a second. So you would choose, because Grant Shapps said, I think yesterday or the day before, he said COVID passports were here possibly for good. Does that mean that you are prepared to never travel overseas again because you don't have or you don't want to prove whether or not you've been vaccinated?
Well, under the current circumstances, I think that we need people to be coming out and saying this is unethical, and we're not going to fan the flames of this unethical narrative that is developing around the vaccine. And so I think it is important for people to take that stand. And you just did exactly yourself there by saying that you respect people's right to make their own decision. And I think that it's important for people who are vaccinated, people who want to be vaccinated, people who are unvaccinated, to all, club together on the side of what is ethical here, so that at least the government won't accept coercion.
So is it unethical for me to ask you whether you have been vaccinated?
Well, I would just simply choose not to answer. Because I believe in medical confidentiality is an important precedent. And so that's the reason why I think that it's a slippery slope when people, we don't want to live in a society where people are asked for their medical status on various subjects, not just on vaccination.
Do you think people should get vaccinated?
I think if they want to get vaccinated, then certainly. I think that people should be allowed to make their own decision about whether or not they feel that they would like to have the vaccine. So I absolutely support those who want to take the vaccine, but I also support the right of those who choose not to.
And if you were trying to advise the government to improve take up by younger people of the vaccine, what should they do?
I think there seems to be evidence that the pop-up stalls work. So making it accessible to those who do want to have the vaccine by bringing it closer to them, making it more convenient for them. That seems to be a way that is both increasing vaccine take-up and is not unethical, because it's neither carrot nor stick.
And you absolutely won't disclose to me whether or not you've been double vaccinated?
On principle, I absolutely won't.
You see, because I don't know what's wrong with me, but I'm happy to say I've been double jabbed. Have I lost my principles?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's up to you. But I because for me, one of the issues here is one of medical confidentiality. I see it as a sort of point of principle that I don't want to disclose that kind of information publicly, because I want to raise awareness of the importance of medical confidentiality. If that's something that you feel comfortable doing, then that is entirely also your decision to do that. And no judging from me.
There we go, Emma. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. That's Emma Webb, social commentator.